Hey y'all, welcome back to my channel. My name is Carrie. This is where I talk about knitting, my tips, my tricks, my opinions, and my preferences. There is an eternal challenge in knitting, and that is working small circumferences in the round. Socks, gloves, fingers on gloves, cuffs. We love knitting these things, but the knitting needles available to us have not always provided the best solution. In the beginning, the only option for knitting anything in the round were double-pointed needles. Many knitters, when they see double-pointed needles, they are running for the hills. They don't even want to learn how to work with these bad boys. But technology evolved, and now we have the circular needle. Circular needles are great. They're adaptable. You can knit with them flat or in the round, but you have to use different techniques like magic loop or two circular needles to knit smaller circumferences. People haven't always loved those options. Technology has evolved once again, and there's a new knitting needle on the market, and that is the flexible double-pointed needle. These are the ADDI Flexi Flips, and I'm going to review them for you today. So if you want to find out if the flexible double-pointed needle is the solution you've been looking for when you want to knit socks, gloves, cuffs, fingers on socks, legs on stuffed animals, whatever small circumference you need to knit, well, hit subscribe, hit the notification bell, give my video a thumbs up, and let's talk about knitting needles. So this review is actually a subscriber request, and I'm really excited about it because it gave me the perfect opportunity to finally try out the Addi Flexi Flips. I first saw these, I think, on Amazon about 2 years ago. I was immediately intrigued because it just seemed like these Addi Flexi Flips could be the perfect marriage of utilizing double-pointed needles and one of my favorite methods for knitting small circumferences in the round, which is to use two circular needles. At least it always has been. We'll see by the end of this video if maybe my mind has changed on this. Ooh, cliffhanger. The Addi Flexi Flips arrived in this very nice solid plastic tube, which will make for good storage later. And each needle has two needle tips connected by a 2-inch cable. So like knitting with two circular needles or even magic loop, the way Addi Flexi Flips work is the stitches are arranged across two needles like this, and then you knit off with the third needle. And I have to say, in a way, it is kind of ingenious because one of the challenges with double-pointed needles is always, let me bring these out here. This point here, the join between two needles, can become an area of uneven tension. A lot of times a ladder is created from looser stitches at this point. And one of the challenges of double-pointed needles is figuring out how to avoid those ladders. With both two circular needles and the flexible double-pointed needles, you only have two spots where you're going to have to transition from one set of needles to another one. So this is kind of an ingenious way of at least reducing the number of spots in your knitting where you can have uneven tension. The Addi Flexi Flips, they come in two different lengths. These are the extra large. So these needle tips are 4 inches long and there is a 2-inch cable. The regular Addi Flexi Flip has 3.5-inch needle tips with a 2-inch cable. Because of my style of knitting, which is to use the pencil grip, I was concerned that a 3.5-inch tip just wouldn't be comfortable enough for me to knit with. And I thought this needle would have the best chance to seduce me into this system of knitting needles. the ADDI FLEXIFLIPS are not the only flexible DPNs that are now on the market. Hiya now has a brand called the High Flyers, and Denise has a set of flexible interchangeable needles available. But a feature of the ADDI FLEXIFLIPS, and why they're called FLEXIFLIPS in the first place, that is different from other brands is that the ADDIs come with two different styles of tips. ADDI knitting needles are known for having their standard tip and then what they call their rockets. The rockets have a sharper tip to them and they are faster needles. I can personally attest to this. I have done the knitting test to find out. If you want to know what I'm talking about, check out my epic needle review. So what ADDI has done with both their DPNs and the ADDI FLEXIFLIPS is they give you both types of needle tip. One end is your standard tip and the other end is the rocket tip. And the theory behind this is you, with one set of needles, have the choice in any knitting situation to use the tip that you want. That seems like a money saver, right? Right? Is it? We'll get to that. We'll get to that. So when I went to go buy some ADDI FLEXIFLIPS, the price that I saw, not counting Etsy or eBay, the price I saw was generally between $20 to $25 for a set of regular ADDI FLEXIFLIPS. For the extra large, that price range was between $25 and $30 that I saw. I ended up ordering the ADDI FLEXIFLIPS extra large from Fabulous Yarns. At Fab Yarns, the needles were themselves $27. However, I had a first-time buyer promotional discount and a volume discount. So even after shipping, the price still came out to $23.61, which was below what I had seen these needles go for in many other places. I believe that I ordered them on a Monday night, and by Friday they were at my house. So Fabulous Yarns was great. I would highly recommend if you are looking to make any kind of purchase, whether it's yarns or needles, check out Fabulous Yarns. I had a wonderful experience. Hashtag not sponsored, not affiliated. I just really liked the store. So the way I decided to test the ADDI FLEXIFLIPS is to knit a glove. This glove I finished on the ADDI FLEXIFLIPS from cast on to cast off to make sure as I worked with them that I wasn't romanticizing working with two circular needles or DPNs. I have started to work the partner of this glove on two circular needles, which is my favorite way, or at least has been. Maybe that'll change. We will find out by the end of this video. But this has been my favorite way to knit smaller circumferences. And I started this cuff on DPNs. So what was it like working with the double pointed needles? Well, let's roll that beautiful knitting footage. So first off, I need to determine which is the sharp side and which is the blunter side. This is the sharp. This is the sharp. That's the sharper side. Okay. I wish there was some indication which side was the sharp side and which side was the blunter side. It looks like all of them, the numbers and everything, the little heart and the numbers are on the side with the sharp end. So that's the thing I guess I need to remember. I'm going to try casting this on the same way I would do double points. So I'm going to cast them all onto one needle, and then I'll divide them between this and the second needle. So I'm going to use the German twist cast on. Oops. Okay, right off the bat, the floppiness of this needle doing a twist start is kind of obnoxious. God. Okay, so something already annoys me about this is as I'm casting this on, the second needle is just flopping around and hitting the desk. And I'm hating that. I'm really hating that. Move these out of the way. Okay, look at how it's flopping around. This needle here was just flopping and hitting the desk, and it was super distracting, and I absolutely hated it. And let's just say that was not a great way to be starting off. Now, to be totally fair, part of the problem with the flopping around had to do with the fact that I was doing this at my desk. And that's not really a fair real-world test of how I would normally knit. Normally when I'm knitting at my couch or on my bed while I'm watching TV or listening to an audiobook or something like that. So I got off camera, I took my knitting to my couch, and I started a real-world test with them. What I'm going to do is I'm going to actually push my desk out of the way so you can see my lap, and I'm going to just knit a couple of rounds. And this is just a plain knit round. So this is definitely once I get the desk out of the way and I'm knitting without the needles flopping onto the desk, it's not as annoying as it was. There's still floppiness going on, and that's going to happen. Whether you use 2 circular needles or DPN'S, having some floppy needles happening is pretty typical. But it's just with these needles, because of that cable in the middle, there's just more floppiness. In comparison to, let's say, knitting with 2 circular needles, where obviously you are going to have an issue with needles flopping around. As I'm going to just show you what it looks like when I knit with 2 circular needles. These back needles are just hanging out on the back of the work, like so. And they do move around a little bit. I'm doing this right now at my desk, and you might be hearing that scraping sound. When I knit with 2 circular needles, I don't find that they flop. I find that the length, both the length of the cable and the weight of the needle itself keeps the needles pointed down the entire time, and so they don't move and get in the way. I know this is not everyone's experience. I know the complaint sometimes with 2 circular needles is they feel like these 2 needles flopping around is in the way. I personally have never had that problem with this method, but something you can always do with 2 circular needles is once the project gets long enough, you can take these back needles and kind of stick them into the knitting itself, and that will keep them still. But I will say with the ADDI Flexi Flip, that sort of flexibility, pardon the pun, with arranging the needles simply doesn't exist. There's only a 2-inch cable. You can see right here that this is as far as they're going to drop. I can't turn the needle and press them into the work the way I can with 2 double-pointed needles. And by 2 double-pointed needles, I mean 2 circular needles. I found the point at the glove that these needles worked best was when I had either the fewest stitches that I was working with or the most stitches that I was working with. So when I got to the body of the glove, the hand, the gusset, all of that, there were enough stitches on the needle that the needles pretty much kind of held a shape like this. And so both sets of needles in my left hand were kind of sticking out straight, and I found at those points working with the needle, I could kind of have my hand positioned in such a way that the needles on the back stayed out of my way. When I had the least stitches on my needle was when I was working the thumb. At that point, all of the stitches were right here on the cable, And so I could really manipulate that needle on the back to be out of the way, and it even would flop down a little bit like it would for two circular needles. The one section of the glove where I really felt like the flexible double pointed needles had a big advantage over DPNs or two circulars was when I was knitting those last thumb stitches. Hey there, Editing Carrie here with a late breaking update. Last night I was finishing the second glove, which I had been using two circular needles to complete, and I got to the thumb gusset and I took one of my needles and using a 24-inch circular needle, I used magic loop to work the thumb stitches. I will say that I found that to be just as comfortable and easy as using the flexible DPNs. So I have to say, having done even more work on this, that even that area with the thumb, I'm not sure the flexible DPN has a big advantage. It was no worse than using the 24-inch magic loop, but it was no better either. Knitting the cuff, however, was when I was most annoyed by these needles. And I think it was because with ribbing, of course, the fabric bunches back together, and so there weren't enough stitches on the needle to kind of keep the front and back needles somewhat straight. So they were floppy, and yet at the same time, I didn't have the flexibility with the needles to kind of arrange things so it was comfortable. One thing that was interesting about working with the Addi Flexi Flips, these two needles in my right hand, once I got to the last stitches, they were just sort of pinched together. And at that point, I almost felt restrained. It felt tight in my hand and it wasn't comfortable. I do not have that kind of experience when I'm working with two circular needles. Like, there's plenty of flexibility here. Because again, the cable is hanging down and there's this cable here. They're just, you know, you can move this around. With double pointed needles, and this is gonna seem ironic because you're talking about 4 straight needles, right? As you get to these last couple of stitches, notice I can still move these needles quite a bit. Like, there's no restraint there at all. These would just, there was no flexibility in moving them. Like, these two needles were gonna stay pretty glued together. Now, that may not bother you, but it certainly bothered me. I think the idea of this, especially because these are kind of more expensive needles, is like, oh, it's like I'm getting 2 needles in one because I have 2 different style of tips. That's amazing! But is it? Is it amazing? If you want to use the lace tip end, like I do, that would be my preference, probably 99% of the time. I have to keep making sure that I am on my right, in my right hand is the rocket end of the needle. When I would get to the end of the row and it was time to put the new needle in my right hand, I would always make sure that I would grab the needle out of my left hand and slide it. And by sliding it out of my left hand, I would always have the end of the tip, the rocket end of the tip, which is the one I wanted to work with, in my right hand. If you put your work down and you pick it back up, you do need to be aware, like, okay, which end do I want? It's, okay, yeah, it's this end. This is the end I want, which isn't necessarily a big deal, but it can be annoying. It can be annoying, but that's not my real issue with the Addi Flexi Flip concept. My real issue is, in my right hand is the tip that I want. It's the rocket. In my left hand would be the opposite tip. And there is no way around that. Why? Because as you knit across, you work across your needle, and when you're finished, that needle is now holding your stitches, and the end that you worked off of is going to be on the back side, the left end. If I had to tink back my work, I'm tinking back with the blunter end, and I hate that. I like to have a sharper tip to tink back with. The other reason I dislike it is when doing decreases, having a sharper tip on the left needle is actually helpful because you're able to have just a little bit more space between the needle and the opening of the stitch to insert your needle into. I know there are people who love this concept. I have read reviews of people who think it's awesome to have that choice of needle tip in one needle. I am not one of those people. So the final question, of course, is would I recommend the Addi Flexi Flip to knitters? And to answer that question, I feel like there's actually two separate questions. One, would I recommend generally the flexible DPN knitting needle system versus would I recommend Addi Flexi Flips? I think it's pretty fair to say that I personally would not recommend Addi Flexi Flips. I think the whole idea of having two different tips on a needle is flawed and it's a gimmick. And frankly, these are expensive needles and I'm not sure having two different, I'm positive that having two different types of tips does not make up for the price of these needles. If you are interested in flexible DPNs, you think this is the knitting solution for you, I personally would try out the Hiya High Flyers or the Denise. The Hiya, they're about the same price range as the Addi's, but they have just one type of point, which I think is better. And the Denise were actually about $15. Not surprising because Denise needles are plastic needles. So, but there are options there. But yeah, I would not get the Addi Flexi Flips. If I had to do it all over again, I would go with the Hiya. In terms of the concept of the flexible DPN, I feel like this review is kind of negative. And I think the review for me is negative only because in some ways I am so comfortable with these other methods. This type of system just doesn't have a place in my knitting life. And that's really what it comes down to. If you're someone like me who's very comfortable working with DPNs, or you're very comfortable with two circular needles, flexible double-pointed needles just don't serve much of a purpose. If you are a knitter though who's coming to knitting in the round for the first time, you're just learning how to do socks, you're just learning how to do smaller circumferences like gloves, I would not recommend the flexible DPN to you. Even though DPNs are a bigger learning curve, I would recommend learning how to work either with magic loop or two circular needles, or learning to work with DPNs first before you approach the flexible DPN. Here's why. A, price point. You can get two circular needles for less than you can get the flexible DPNs. You can get two Addi circular needles for less than you can get the Flexi Flips. Also, I think the fact that I am comfortable working with DPNs and I do know how to work with two circular needles set me up to understand how to work with these needles faster than if I were a newer knitter. I think that the learning curve with the flexible DPNs, it's probably in between working with two circular needles and working with DPNs. Now, if you are a more experienced knitter and you have tried all the other methods, you have done two circular needles, you have done magic loop, you have done DPNs, you have even maybe done 9-inch circular needles, and you're like, all of them I'm meh on. It might be worth it to you to try out the flexible double-pointed needles. What do you think? Have you tried the Addi Flexi Flips? Do you love them? Do you hate them? Do you have a favorite method of knitting small circumferences like socks and gloves and what have you? What are they? Are you a magic loop person? Are you a two circular needle person? Are you a DPN person? What is your favorite way to knit in the round? I would love to hear about it in the comments down below. I hope you enjoyed today's video and you found it helpful. If so, please give it a thumbs up and share it with your knitting friends. If you have not already, please hit subscribe and the notification bell. Hitting subscribe and the notification bell is another way that you can support my channel and let YouTube know that I am a channel worth checking out. I hope that you have a wonderful day, evening, weekend, weeknight, whenever you may be watching this, and as always, happy health and happy knitting. Bye!